Tonight's story is about a policeman assigned to guard a dead man who wakes up to discover the crime scene has been stolen. Rain smears the shoreline into one gray strip. A lantern glow wavers in the distance, and his hand finds only leather where his gun should be. Where is the body? The problem was no tracks to follow. Not a tide that pulled it away. Not an animal that dragged it. Not a mistake he could explain. Not a delay he could fix. Just a lonely shore, an empty holster, and then daylight. On the coast near Antelias, the sea doesn't roar the way it does in winter postcards. It hisses. It hisses into shingle and broken shell, into the dark seams between rocks, into the mouths of storm drains that empty rainwater like a steady, guilty breath. And on the morning this happened, the sea was doing that same thing, hissing softly, insistently, while the sky turned the color of watered ash, and a young policeman stood on the sand with his heart beating in a way that made him feel exposed. Because the body was gone. Not moved a little, not pulled by tide, not dragged by animal. Gone. And the holster at his hip, where a man's job and pride and proof are supposed to sit, was empty too. Farid Jaber stared at the belt as if the leather itself had betrayed him. For a moment he couldn't move. He could hear the rain easing off into a thin, cold drizzle, could hear his own breath catching in his throat, could hear, too, the faint thump of water against stone somewhere beyond him, where the beach bent out of sight. There were no footprints near the place he'd been lying. That was the part that made his stomach turn first. If someone had come close, there should have been something. A scuff, a heel mark, a line in the sand. But the rain had been working all night, and it had erased the small evidence as neatly as a hand smoothing a bedsheet. Farid's mouth went dry. He reached down and touched the sand where the corpse had been, where he had been told to keep it safe until morning. The sand was cold and heavy and packed hard by the weather. He stared at his hand, as if it didn't belong to him. Then he remembered the exact moment he'd closed his eyes. Not an image, more like a sensation. The rain pushing through the collar of his coat, his shoulders tight with shivering. The dead weight of exhaustion pressing down behind his eyes. The thought, quick, shameful, almost childlike, that if he rested his head just for a moment, he could still be alert. He told himself that, just for a moment. And now dawn had arrived and something impossible had happened while he was asleep. Farid swallowed and felt his throat scrape. He forced his hand to his belt again, as if his fingers might find the gun through stubbornness alone. Nothing. He had his knife, his service knife, heavy in its sheath. And when he drew it out, it felt pathetic against the open emptiness of the beach. A small blade against the kind of person who could walk up to a headless corpse, lift it, carry it away, and steal a policeman's weapon like plucking fruit from a branch. A thought came, uninvited and sharp. They could have killed you too. Farid looked out at the sea, at the gray light on the water, at the empty beach stretching north and south. He tried to picture the corpse walking away under its own power, headless and obedient like some nightmare saint. He tried to picture an animal dragging it, but there were no trails, no marks. He tried to picture the tide lifting it, but he would have felt the water, wouldn't he? Would have jolted awake cold and choking. And then, as his mind ran through those possibilities and found each one too thin to hold the weight of reality, another thought slid in, heavier than the rest. A person did this. A person had come while he slept. A person had touched the body and his belt and his gun. A person was close enough to hear his breathing. Farid turned slowly, scanning the line where beach met rocks, where rocks met the beginnings of the village. Antelias lay just beyond the curve of the shore, a modest place not far from Beirut, where the sea felt like a neighbor and not a boundary. The lights in the windows would still be dim at this hour. The fishermen still deciding whether the weather was worth it. The mothers still warming yesterday's bread for children, who would complain about the damp and ask why the world smelled like wet stone. Farid's family lived not far away. Everyone's family lived not far away. That was what made Antelias feel safe. What made it feel like a place where you didn't need to imagine bodies on beaches. Farid had never imagined it. Until last night. It had started with a call, an ordinary thing, delivered in the weary tone of a man who had been dragged out of a chair and away from a cup of tea. Someone had seen something on the shore, something shaped wrong, something that might be driftwood, might be an animal, might be... They didn't say it plainly, not over the line. In a place like this, you avoided certain words. You let implication carry what you didn't want to name. Farid had gone with his partner, boots sinking into sand, rain slanting into their faces. His partner had been older, steadier, the kind of man who could make a cigarette last through a whole conversation. Farid was the junior one, still learning how to keep his expression neutral, still trying to convince his body not to flinch at sudden sounds. They had walked the beach with flashlights, the beams cutting trembling paths through the rain. Farid remembered the way the light had caught on wet stones and made them shine like teeth. Then they'd seen it. A shape on the sand, downshore, dark against the pale foam line. Human-sized, human-proportioned, too still. They approached carefully, guns drawn. Not because they were brave, but because a body can be bait. And Farid had been taught that much even in a small village station. By the time they were close enough for the rain to run in little rivers off the thing's clothing, Farid's partner had stopped breathing for a second. Farid followed his gaze. It was a man on his back, arms at odd angles, legs stiff as if the cold had already claimed him entirely. And where the head should have been. Farid's mind tried to reject it, tried to rearrange it into something else. But there was only the blunt end of a neck, the collar torn and soaked, the absence so complete, it felt like a sound. Farid had stood there, rain on his eyelashes, and thought absurdly of his mother's insistence that he eat more, that he keep weight on his bones, that he not become thin as a reed because the world was hungry for young men like him. A headless man on their beach in Antelias. His partner had cursed under his breath. They searched quickly, flashlights sweeping the empty shoreline, but they found no one. No other signs, just the rain, the sea, and the corpse. And then the practical problem. What do you do when you don't have the tools for something like this? They weren't Beirut police with radios and cars and men to spare. They were a handful of officers in a place where the worst nights usually involved drunk arguments, stolen chickens, the occasional fistfight outside a cafe. They had no way to summon a proper team at midnight in a storm. They had to decide, with the grim patience of men who understood their limits, how to keep the situation from becoming worse. One would go back to the station to raise the alarm properly. One would stay, guard the corpse, guard the scene, guard the thin line of dignity that still existed around the dead man. Farid already knew the decision before it was spoken. Junior officers did not argue. Junior officers proved themselves by enduring discomfort without complaint. His partner squeezed his shoulder once, almost kindly, almost apologetic, and said something like, "Stay awake, keep your eyes open, I'll come back with help." Then the older man's flashlight dwindled down the beach, swallowed by rain, and Farid was alone with the body. At first he tried to do everything correctly. He kept moving, pacing short lines so his blood wouldn't slow. He scanned the horizon with his light. He looked inland, toward the low structures that hugged the coast. Small sheds, fishing huts, places where nets were stored and wood was piled, where men sometimes hid from wives when they wanted quiet. The rain made the world smaller. It turned the beach into a narrow corridor of visibility. Farid's thoughts circled. Who could do this? Who would do this here? He tried to remember faces, men with angry eyes, men with debts, men who had drifted into town and never quite belonged. His partner had once mentioned a name, someone known, someone with a reputation that moved like smoke through conversation. Arslan, he remembered. Arafan Arslan. The name carried the faintest chill, not because Farid had met him, but because people said it carefully. Known thief, known trouble, known murderer if the speaker wanted to be dramatic. But Farid told himself not to invent villains. A headless body didn't need a legend attached to it. It needed work. It needed patience. He kept telling himself he would not sleep. He was a policeman. He had his gun. He had his knife. He had the authority of the uniform, even if the uniform was soaked through and heavy on his shoulders like a punishment. But as the night dragged forward, the cold made its own arguments. His shivering turned to an ache in his bones. His fingers stiffened around the flashlight. His eyelids began to feel like weights, each blink slightly longer than the last. And there was something else, the kind of fear that doesn't shout, the kind that sits inside you and slowly convinces your body that stillness is safer than movement. The corpse was there, headless, silent. Farid found himself looking at it too often, as if expecting it to change. He imagined the head somewhere else, hidden, tossed, carried like an object. He imagined the face. He imagined what expression it might have held at the end. He imagined the moment of separation and had to force the thought away, swallowing hard, tasting rain and bile. At some point he crouched, then sat, then leaned back against the sand embankment where the beach rose slightly toward the rocky verge. He told himself he would rest his eyes without sleeping. He told himself he would listen for footsteps, for voices, for the sound of another human being. And the rain kept falling, steady as a lullaby. Farid's head dipped. His body, exhausted and cold, betrayed him with the quiet efficiency of nature. Sleep took him. When he woke, it was like surfacing from dark water. His first sensation was panic, pure and immediate, because he couldn't remember where he was for a half second. Then memory slammed into place. Beach, storm, corpse, duty. He scrambled up, sand clinging to his coat, heart pounding, and the space where the body had been was empty. He spun in place, shining his flashlight in wild arcs. He expected to see someone running, expected to see the outline of a man dragging a burden, expected to see anything that would make sense of what he was seeing. Nothing. Only rain. Only dawn's thin, reluctant light. Then his hand went to his holster, and it was empty, and the panic changed shape into something sharper. Farid's breath came fast. He drew his knife, holding it low like a man who knew he looked ridiculous. He forced himself to walk up and down the sand, scanning for tracks, for drag marks, for anything. But the rain had washed the beach into a clean slate. It had cleaned away the evidence of his failure. Farid's mind flicked through what would happen next. His partner would return with men, with questions, with faces that would change when they saw what was missing. Farid would stand there, soaked and shivering, and try to explain how he had lost a corpse and a gun in the same night. He saw it in his imagination like a prophecy. The captain's stare, the tightening of mouths, the inevitable conclusion that Farid was unfit, careless, an embarrassment. He thought of his family again, of his mother's pride when he'd earned the uniform, of the way neighbors had nodded respectfully when he passed, of the steady pay he brought home, of how fragile all of it truly was. And beneath that fear, another fear pressed in. If someone had taken the corpse, why? Why return for it? Why risk stealing it from a guarded scene? Unless the corpse itself was the danger, the evidence, the thing that could point back to the person who had done it. Farid looked inland again, toward the low huts and sheds by the shore. The village was waking slowly. Somewhere a rooster called. Somewhere a door creaked open. Farid could not simply stand on the beach waiting for humiliation to arrive. He needed to find the body. He needed to find his gun. And he needed, desperately, to turn this night into something that did not end his life as he knew it. He began walking, knife in hand, toward the nearest structures. The first hut was empty, smelling of fish and wet rope. The second had a locked door. The third was farther down, closer to the end of the beach where the shore narrowed and rocks jutted out like knuckles. And there, in the dim gray light, Farid saw movement. A man, not running, not hiding, chopping wood. The figure stood near a small pile of logs, raising an axe and bringing it down in a steady rhythm. Each strike made a dull sound in the wet air. The man's posture was calm, almost domestic, like someone preparing for a day that had nothing to do with corpses or stolen guns. Farid hesitated. The rational part of him tried to whisper caution. You are alone. You have only a knife. Your gun is gone. You don't know who this is. But desperation is louder than reason, especially when you're young and the world feels like it can end with a single mistake. Farid walked toward the man, boots sinking slightly with each step, rain slicking his hair to his forehead. As he approached, the man paused, resting the axe head on the log. He looked up. His face was plain in the weak light, not monstrous, not theatrical. Just a man in wet clothes, eyes narrowed against the drizzle. What are you doing out here? The man asked. His voice was rough, unimpressed. Farid tried to speak calmly. He tried to sound like authority and not panic. There was an incident, Farid said, and even that felt too thin, too polite, like he was describing a broken window and not a headless corpse. A body? It was on the beach? The man's expression didn't change much, but his gaze flicked briefly past Farid toward the shore. A body, he repeated, as if tasting the word. Farid watched him carefully. It's missing now, Farid said. And my weapon is missing. I need to know if you saw anyone. Any movement. Any lights. The man's eyes lingered on Farid's belt, on the empty holster, on the knife in Farid's hand. No, the man said. I didn't see anyone. Farid felt his heartbeat thud in his throat. He took a breath, steadying himself. You live here? Farid asked. The man shrugged. Near enough. Farid looked toward the hut behind him. Smoke did not rise from its chimney. The door looked old. The place looked like it belonged to someone who lived on the edge of things. Farid's mind raced. The missing corpse, the missing gun, the man chopping wood at dawn near a hut. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was everything. Farid swallowed, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. I need to look inside, Farid said, trying to make it a command. The man's eyes hardened. No. Farid's grip tightened on the knife. His thoughts spiraled toward disaster. He could feel the night's failure closing around him like a trap. He could feel the approaching morning, his partner, the detectives, the questions. Like footsteps he could already hear. And in that tightening, suffocating pressure, a thought flickered through Farid's mind. Ugly, irrational. Born not of logic, but of survival panic. A substitute. If he could not produce the original body, if he could not produce his gun, then he could produce something else. Something that looked like he had done his job. A headless corpse on a beach, guarded all night. A scene that did not change. A scene that would let him keep his uniform. It was a thought so shocking that Farid almost stopped walking. But the thought did not leave. It stayed. It settled into him with the cold. The man shifted his stance slightly, as if preparing for trouble. The axe was still in his hands. Farid stared at the axe, then at the hut, then at the man's neck. The line of skin above his collar. His knife felt suddenly very heavy. "I said no," the man repeated, voice low now. Farid heard himself breathing. He heard the sea. He heard the rain softening as if the world was leaning closer to listen. And then Farid moved. What happened next would not be told the way Farid experienced it. In his own mind, it would become a blur of instinct and shame, of fear and justification. He would later insist, when he could still speak clearly, that he hadn't meant it, that he had been panicked, that he had only wanted to scare the man into talking. But the body does what the body does when the mind breaks its own rules. Farid lunged. The man recoiled, axe half raised, surprise flashing across his face. Farid's knife struck. The man stumbled backward, boots skidding on wet sand. Farid pressed forward, a young man suddenly gone feral with desperation, driven by a single frantic need. Fix this before it becomes real. The man went down near the woodpile, the axe slipping from his grasp. Farid stood over him, chest heaving, rain on his face, mixing with something warmer that he didn't want to identify. He stared at what he had done, as if it belonged to someone else. For a moment, he expected the man to speak, to curse, to bargain, to threaten, to reveal himself as the villain Farid needed him to be. But the man only made a small sound, like a breath trying to find its way out. Then the sound stopped. Farid stood in the rain, shaking. He looked toward the beach, toward the place where his partner would soon arrive, and something inside him hardened. He could not undo this. He could only continue. By the time Farid's partner returned with a handful of detectives and other officers, the rain had thinned into a cold mist. From a distance, the scene looked almost the same as it had the night before. A policeman standing near a headless body on the sand. Farid's partner felt relief for exactly 3 seconds. Then he saw the clothes. Different fabric. Different cut. Not the same as the corpse they had found in the storm. His relief curdled into suspicion so quickly, it made his face tighten. He approached, stepping carefully, flashlight still in hand out of habit. "Farid," he said, voice clipped. "What is this?" Farid did not answer immediately. His face was pale, eyes too bright, as if he had been crying without tears. "I guarded it," Farid said finally. His voice sounded strange, thin, and far away. "I guarded it all night." His partner stared at him, then stared at the corpse, then looked back at Farid's empty holster. "Where's your gun?" Farid swallowed. It was taken. The detectives moved closer, bending to examine the body. They did not speak loudly, but Farid heard fragments. Not the same man. Different build. Different. His partner's jaw clenched. "Where is the other body?" he demanded. "The one from last night?" Farid's eyes flicked toward the hut at the end of the beach, then away again. Fareed began, and then his voice collapsed into silence. The rest of the morning became a search, a widening circle of questions and footsteps, men moving through Antelias, with the particular grim energy of a place confronting something it never wanted to imagine within its borders. Neighbors were questioned. Fishermen were questioned. Anyone who had been awake in the storm was questioned. And slowly, piece by piece, the story began to form. Not a neat story, not a story that satisfied the mind, but a story that could explain the physical facts. A hut near the end of the beach, said to belong to Arifan Arslan, a man whose name carried bad reputation, was searched. Inside, they found what Fareed's empty holster had promised them they might find. Fareed's gun, a bag of money, and the missing head, the head of the first corpse. The evidence suggested a straightforward conclusion. The man whose hut held those items had killed the victim, taken his money, and tried to erase the body once police appeared. In the eyes of the village, it fit the shape of an understandable world. A known criminal did a criminal thing, and in the eyes of the law, it looked like a case already solved. Except the beach held two headless bodies now. And Fareed, who should have been a witness, a guard, a simple piece of the machinery, was trembling like a man about to fall apart. When they pressed him, the story twisted. They learned that the first victim was not a stranger. He was Habib Jaber, Fareed's cousin, which explained at least why Fareed's face had the haunted look of a man whose mind was trying to outrun itself. It explained why his words came out wrong, why his eyes darted like trapped birds. Because somewhere in the chaos of that night, Fareed had stood beside his cousin's headless corpse without knowing it was Habib, had watched the sea hiss beside him, had fallen asleep near his own blood, and when dawn came, Fareed had seen failure. Only failure, without seeing the deeper horror underneath. When the investigators pieced together the timing, they arrived at a grim possibility. Arifan Arslan had come back for the corpse after realizing it would lead to him. He'd found it guarded. He'd noticed the guard asleep. He'd taken the body and, boldly, casually, had taken the policeman's gun too, as if collecting tools. Then, at his hut, he had prepared to burn the evidence, gathering wood while the storm still hung over the coast. And in that window, while Arslan was out chopping wood, Fareed had woken and stumbled into the scene like a man walking into his own fate, not knowing who Arslan was, not knowing what he carried, not knowing even that the corpse he'd failed to protect belonged to his cousin. Only knowing that his job was slipping away. Only knowing that the world would judge him. Only knowing that he needed the beach to look the same by morning. So Fareed attacked the man at the hut to create a substitute. And in the cruelest turn of all, the man he attacked was the very murderer of his cousin. Justice achieved by accident, through madness. The village did not celebrate. Fareed was arrested because no matter what the man had done, Fareed had done what Fareed had done, out of fear, out of desperation, out of a mind that buckled under cold rain and responsibility and shame. When they brought Fareed away from the shore, he did not fight them at first. He walked with the strange obedience of someone already gone somewhere else. But when they passed the edge of the beach, when the salt air gave way to the smell of wet streets and cooking fires, Fareed began to speak in fragments. He asked the same question again and again, voice rising, then collapsing. Where is his head? Sometimes he meant the first victim. Sometimes he meant the second. Sometimes he meant his own. He did not seem to know the difference. By the end of the day, those who saw him described it the same way. Fareed suffered a complete mental collapse. The kind of collapse you can't tidy up with a report. The kind of collapse that turns a man into a cautionary story, whispered in kitchens when rain starts tapping the window panes. The case had its tangible ending. Bodies accounted for, evidence gathered, a suspect revealed, a policeman taken into custody, and, eventually, into whatever place the state had for broken minds. But Antelias kept one residue it could not wash away, no matter how hard the winter rain fell. The knowledge that on a safe beach in a quiet village, a man could stand guard beside the dead. And the most dangerous thing on the shore was not the murderer returning in the dark. It was the guard himself, waking at dawn with nothing left to lose. This was midnight horror society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session. Sleep well.